You know what no one wants to admit? The moment you stop chasing someone who runs from intimacy, they start watching your every move. They won't text, they won't call, but their silence becomes louder. They want to see if you're breaking. They want to know if the absence is tearing at your soul. Because deep down, beyond all that cool detachment, behind all that so-called peace, they're hoping your silence is a scream. And when it isn't, everything starts to shift. What the avoidant secretly expects during no contact is your collapse, your unraveling, your need. But here's the spiritual truth. When you choose stillness over desperation, when you hold the line not out of punishment but out of alignment, you're not just healing, you're awakening. You see, we've been taught to think that love equals proximity, that caring must be performed, that silence means disconnection, but spiritual power doesn't chase chaos, it doesn't beg for crumbs, it knows that distance can be divine, that space can be sacred, that the real test is not whether you reach out, but whether you can reach inward. Avoidants live in fear of being engulfed, so they distance. But when you go quiet, truly quiet, not the kind that sees or strategizes, but the kind born of peace, they expect it to be temporary. They expect your dignity to have a timer. Because in their world, silence is punishment or game. They rarely expect it to be transformation. So when you hold that line, not with anger, but with stillness, they feel it. They may never tell you, but it shakes them. Because detachment isn't cold, it's clear. It's the refusal to abandon yourself ever again, in the name of love. And let me tell you something else. They're not just waiting to hear from you. They're hoping they still live rent-free in your head. That even in no contact, they still get to star in your thoughts. But when your silence is fueled by purpose, not pain, they lose that power. They crave your energy, not your voice. Your validation, not your truth. But when you become unavailable, not as punishment, but as protection, everything they depended on crumbles. That's when the avoidant starts to feel the very thing they tried to avoid all along, the weight of emotional absence. And still you don't move. That's strength. Not the kind that screams I don't care, but the kind that whispers I've finally remembered who I am. What they never saw coming is that no contact wasn't a tactic, it was your turning point. It wasn't silence for silence's sake, it was spiritual recalibration, emotional sovereignty. And now every minute that you stay silent, steady, and surrender to your peace, you become untouchable. Not because you're closed, but because you're chosen by yourself. Avoidance equates space with safety because intimacy for them feels like a trap rather than a sanctuary. While others draw closer when they care, the avoidant pulls away, not out of malice, but out of wiring. Somewhere deep in their story, closeness became synonymous with overwhelm, with losing themselves, with emotional suffocation. So they learn, consciously or not, that distance equals control. That space is a protective barrier between their vulnerability and potential pain. They don't always recognize this dynamic, but it shapes everything: how they attach, how they respond to conflict, and especially how they navigate silence. During no contact, the avoidant doesn't experience relief the way you might assume. Yes, initially the space provides them regulation, their nervous system exhales, it confirms a subconscious belief, I'm safe because I'm alone. But here's the hidden truth. They also begin observing. They don't speak, but they watch, even if only energetically. The distance becomes a silent arena where their need for safety collides with their quiet curiosity. Will they chase me? Do I still matter to them? That space, while designed to protect them from engulfment, also acts as a stage for subtle tests. Not openly, not with words, but emotionally, spiritually. They look for proof that they're still significant to you without having to step back into the arena of vulnerability. Because what they fear most is losing themselves. The irony? In trying so hard to protect their identity through detachment, they rarely get to experience real intimacy. So no contact becomes a paradox. It feels like freedom, but it's also a mirror. It reflects their avoidance, their fears, and their unmet longing. And while they hide behind emotional autonomy, they are always, on some level, wondering if space will protect them or expose them. The avoidant expects you to break first because that pattern has worked before. Whether consciously or unconsciously, they've learned to rely on others to bridge the emotional gap they keep creating. They create distance, and someone else closes it. It reinforces a dynamic where they remain emotionally in control, protected from vulnerability, while the other person becomes the emotional laborer in the relationship. During no contact, this expectation doesn't vanish, it intensifies. They don't interpret the silence as your strength. They interpret it as a waiting game. They expect to win. They believe your attachment will overpower your boundaries, that your desire for connection will eventually override your commitment to self-respect. They expect the silence to grow too heavy for you, that your need to understand, to fix, to reconnect will lead you right back to them. And they count on that moment not just to reestablish contact, but to reassure themselves that they were never truly at risk of being left. It's a deep, often hidden need to feel chosen without having to choose, to be desired without being emotionally available. So when you don't reach out, when you remain steady in your silence, it begins to destabilize the internal narrative they've clung to, that they can disconnect without consequence. The avoidant rarely considers that your silence could be rooted in strength rather than sorrow. They anticipate your return as a form of emotional gravity. They expect you to be pulled back in. And when that doesn't happen, it quietly forces them to confront something uncomfortable, that the emotional safety net they've always depended on may no longer be there. Your refusal to chase does more than confuse them. It challenges their belief that love always bends, always waits, always comes back, and that challenge shakes the very foundation of their avoidance. Silence for the avoidant is never just absence, it becomes a hidden test, a quiet audition where they watch to see what your non-response really means. They may not say it, and they certainly won't show it, but during no contact, they're paying close attention not to your words, but to your energy, your patterns, your consistency, or lack thereof. For the avoidant, no contact is not always interpreted as rejection. Instead, it becomes a measure of your emotional endurance. They wonder if your silence will hold or if you'll eventually fold under the weight of not being chosen. This test is less about cruelty and more about confirmation. They're looking to confirm something they deeply believe, that they don't have to risk vulnerability to maintain significance in someone's life. They expect the silence to pressure you into self-doubt, that you'll begin to question your worth, your value, your impact. They hope the absence creates just enough discomfort to push you into proving yourself, into trying harder, into initiating, into relieving their emotional discomfort without ever having to address yours. But when your silence doesn't spiral into desperation, when you don't chase, fix, explain, or plead, it creates a disruption. Because now the avoidant has to interpret your silence differently, not as withdrawal, but as elevation. You holding the line becomes a statement. It says, without a word, I will not audition for love. And that unnerves them, because if they can no longer elicit a reaction from you, if they no longer occupy your mental and emotional space, then they're no longer in control of the narrative. That realization is quiet, but it cuts deep, because what was supposed to be a test of your longing becomes a reflection of your strength, and they feel it more in your silence than they ever did in your presence. Avoidants crave reassurance, but they want it without having to take on the responsibility that real intimacy requires. They want to feel wanted, missed, longed for, but from a distance that keeps them emotionally safe. During no contact, they secretly hope you're still emotionally invested. They imagine you thinking about them, scrolling through old messages, questioning your silence. That imagined attachment gives them comfort, not because they intend to come closer, but because it feeds their sense of worth without requiring vulnerability. They want the emotional benefit of being missed without the relational work of being present. This is the contradiction they live in, wanting to feel chosen without having to fully show up. So in no contact, they don't always miss you in the way you might miss them. What they miss is how they felt being desired by you. They miss the security of knowing someone out there is still emotionally tied to them. Even if they never plan to reciprocate that depth, they want to be remembered, even revered, but without the discomfort of confronting why they left or why they never fully let you in. That's what makes no contact so disarming to them. It removes their silent audience. It dissolves the echo chamber of their ego. When you stay silent, not as a strategy but as a declaration of self-worth, it disrupts the energy dynamic they're used to. The chase stops, the over-functioning ends, and for once they are left with the reality they've always avoided, being responsible for the very distance they created. They don't expect to be forgotten. They don't expect you to detach, so when you do, it threatens their illusion that they can remain emotionally distant and still be energetically fed. No contact becomes not just silence, it becomes accountability. The avoidant expects your self-worth to crumble in their absence because that has often been the unspoken outcome in their relational patterns. Not because they consciously want to harm you, but because their detachment is designed to create imbalance. When they pull away, withdraw, or go silent, they assume the other person will question themselves, wonder what they did wrong, search for closure, and begin to internalize blame. This reaction reaffirms the avoidant's belief that emotional distance equals power. If their absence destabilizes you, it confirms to them that they were significant, that they mattered, and more importantly, that they never have to fully engage to hold space in someone else's heart. They are used to others collapsing under the weight of their inconsistency. They expect you to fill in the silence with stories, justifications, and self-criticism. That's where the real grip of avoidance lies, not just in withdrawal but in the way it subtly invites you to abandon yourself, trying to understand them. And when your self-worth starts to unravel, the avoidant feels safe, because then they are no longer the emotionally unavailable one, you become the unstable one. It distorts the truth of the dynamic and allows them to maintain a sense of superiority while staying emotionally disengaged. But when you remain grounded, when you don't spiral or shrink in the silence, it defies the story they've been telling themselves. That others are fragile, that closeness always leads to chaos, that their distance is justified. Your resilience becomes unsettling. Because now, they're not witnessing someone fall apart, they're watching someone rise in their absence. And that kind of strength doesn't feed their ego. It confronts their fear. It says you can hold your own emotional center. And that is something they never expected to see, let alone feel challenged by. Your peace is their disruption because it stands in direct opposition to the emotional script they've rehearsed their entire life. The avoidant thrives in dynamics where emotional imbalance exists, where one person reaches and the other retreats. When you are calm, composed, and centered in your silence, you disturb that rhythm. You no longer respond in the predictable way. You do not chase, you do not collapse, you do not try to decode their silence. And that unnerves them more than any confrontation ever could, because now the power they once held through distance is no longer effective. Their withdrawal no longer creates chaos, it creates clarity, and that clarity belongs to you. They count on your unrest. They expect your anxiety to re-establish the connection they keep avoiding. But when you hold your peace, it forces them to sit with their own emotional emptiness. Your groundedness becomes a mirror reflecting the absence not just of your presence, but of their own emotional maturity. It becomes impossible to hide behind the narrative that they're simply not ready or need space, because your peace speaks volumes. It says you're not angry, you're just done trying to make someone emotionally responsible for what they're unwilling to face. In no contact, peace becomes your language. And unlike begging or pleading, peace cannot be argued with. It doesn't provoke, it doesn't perform, it simply is. And that energy is deeply unsettling to someone who expects love to be loud, messy, and full of evidence that they are wanted. Your peace removes their ability to measure their worth through your reaction. It creates a stillness in which their avoidance is no longer masked, it is exposed. And for someone who has always used emotional distance as protection, being faced with your calm detachment is not just disruptive, it is revealing. The avoidant is often more connected to you energetically than they will ever admit out loud. Even when they initiate distance or disappear into silence, they quietly hope you remain spiritually anchored to them. That somewhere in your heart you're still thinking of them, still longing, still emotionally attached, even if the physical connection is gone. It gives them a sense of emotional significance without requiring any effort, responsibility, or vulnerability. They want the tether without the touch, the bond without the burden. And as long as they believe you're still holding space for them in your heart, they can stay emotionally distant without feeling the full cost of their absence. This unspoken expectation is not always conscious, but it's deeply ingrained. The avoidance survives on the assumption that you're still energetically orbiting around them, that you haven't truly let go, just paused, that even in silence your soul hasn't moved on. This allows them to feel emotionally relevant without having to face the discomfort of real intimacy, and it protects them from the terrifying reality that they could be forgotten, not punished, not hated, but simply released. They don't expect your silence to be clean, grounded, or sovereign. They expect it to be heavy. They imagine it's filled with yearning, waiting, regret. And when it isn't, when your energy detaches along with your words, it creates an emptiness they weren't prepared for. Not the kind of emptiness they're used to, the one they control, but a hollow space where they can no longer feel your emotional presence. That space doesn't soothe them, it confronts them. Because what they feared more than closeness was being truly unseen, truly unfelt, truly unloved. And your energetic detachment doesn't scream, it doesn't beg, it doesn't chase. It simply disappears, and that is the one thing they never learned how to handle. The avoidant is drawn to the familiar, even if the familiar is unhealthy. They often gravitate toward dynamics where they feel emotionally safe through distance, not closeness. Intimacy for them isn't soothing, it's threatening. So they create patterns that protect them from feeling too much, too deeply, or too fast. But here's the paradox. While they fear emotional intensity, they are also attracted to the very people who challenge that avoidance. They're drawn to your strength, your presence, your emotional availability until it becomes too real. Then they retreat, not because you've done something wrong, but because your emotional depth exposes their emotional limitation. They didn't expect to meet someone who could hold space for them and still hold boundaries, someone who could love deeply but not lose themselves. That kind of presence unnerves them, it disrupts their cycle. They expect people to either become emotionally dependent on them or reject them entirely. But when you do neither, when you stay rooted in your own worth and offer connection without chasing, it confuses them. It doesn't fit their emotional script. They know how to handle drama, they know how to handle distance, but they don't know how to handle calm, grounded intimacy. That kind of connection feels unfamiliar and therefore unsafe. So they pull away, not realizing that they are leaving the very thing their soul has always longed for. You become the contradiction they weren't prepared for. Someone who offers love, but not at the expense of self. Someone who gives without demanding, but also walks away without fear. That energy is magnetic, but it's also intimidating, because it asks them to grow, to show up, to be known. And while they may not say it, that level of connection both terrifies and intrigues them in equal measure. The avoidant does not expect you to find clarity without them. In their internal narrative, they hold an unspoken belief that you will remain confused, emotionally entangled, and endlessly seeking answers, that you will spend your silence in mental loops, analyzing, replaying, hoping. This belief gives them a false sense of emotional leverage. It allows them to remain distant while still feeling significant. As long as you are still searching for closure, they are still present in your mind, still a central character in your story, and that illusion keeps them from having to face their own role in the disconnection. What unsettles the avoidant is when you begin to find clarity not through conversation with them but through your own healing. When you stop needing their explanation, their validation, their acknowledgement to move forward, it disrupts the emotional power dynamic. Because now you're not just silent, you're sovereign, you've reclaimed your narrative, and in doing so you've removed their ability to exist as an unresolved chapter in your life. They expected your silence to be temporary, a pause in your attachment. They never anticipated it would become transformation. When you begin to find peace in your own answers rather than waiting for theirs, it confronts the avoidant with something they rarely confront themselves: accountability. Because now they are not just someone you miss, they are someone you've outgrown. Not out of anger, but out of awakening. You begin to see the avoidance for what it is, not a mystery, but a mirror, a reflection of their fear, their limitation, their unwillingness to meet love with courage. That kind of clarity doesn't just shift the dynamic, it ends it not with bitterness but with truth. And that is the one thing they hoped you'd never find without them. The avoidant doesn't expect your detachment to be real. They expect it to be temporary, performative, maybe even strategic. In their world, people don't leave, they wait. They pause, they act silent as a form of manipulation or emotional leverage. So when you begin to detach, not just in action but in essence, it disrupts their perception of power. Because for the first time, your silence is not rooted in hope. It's not an emotional standstill waiting for their return. It's not a tactic, it's truth. You've emotionally released what they thought you'd hold on to indefinitely. Avoidants often test the strength of your attachment by seeing how much distance you'll tolerate before you break. They confuse endurance with devotion. They assume that the deeper the bond, the longer you'll wait. So when you don't wait, when you choose peace over potential, clarity over confusion, it disorients them. Not because they suddenly realize they love you, but because they realize they've lost access to your emotional energy. And for someone who has built safety around being the one who controls the connection, that loss feels like a collapse. Your detachment is not loud. It doesn't come with ultimatums or grand exits. It arrives quietly. It settles in the soul. And that's what makes it powerful. Because you are no longer performing your worth. You are no longer waiting for them to choose you. You've chosen yourself. And in doing so, you become someone they no longer recognize, because you no longer fit inside the version of you that tolerated their inconsistency. This is what they never expected, that the silence would not be a space for them to return, but a space where you return to yourself, that your detachment would not be a plea but a boundary, not a strategy but a revelation. So let this be the truth that settles in your bones. You are not waiting. You are not holding space for someone who cannot meet you, see you, or choose you. You are not shrinking yourself to be understood by someone who fears their own depth. You are not making room for a love that hides behind distance and calls it freedom. Your silence is not an echo of pain, it is the sound of alignment. Your detachment is not absence, it is presence with yourself. And when you choose peace over the pattern, when you choose self-respect over emotional crumbs, when you stop proving your worth to someone who refuses to receive it, everything changes. You are not here to be an emotional holding place for those still afraid of their own heart. You are here to walk in truth, to lead with strength, to embody love that does not beg. Let the avoidant wrestle with their silence. Let them face the mirror that your absence became. Let them feel the cost of what they could not hold. Because your clarity is not cruelty, your boundary is not bitterness, and your detachment is not the end of your love. It is the beginning of your liberation. And from that place you rise.